I never expected to learn the darkest truth about my father through a dusty, leather-bound diary hidden in the back of his old cabinet. Growing up, I always knew something was wrong with him. He was distant, plagued by nightmares, and spent countless nights locked away in his study, whispering to himself, but I never understood why. When he died, I thought his suffering had ended. But as I sat in his empty house, flipping through his journal, I realized his torment hadn't died with him. It had been waiting for me to uncover it. The diary reads, "If you're reading this, I'm already gone, and maybe that's for the best. But before you judge me, before you say I was a weak man, know this. I didn't do it for greed. I did it to save the woman I loved." The diary stated my father had been a mortician for over 20 years, a job that demanded both precision and emotional detachment. He had seen bodies in every imaginable state, accidents, suicides, murders, but nothing had ever shaken him, until the night he made the mistake that destroyed him. It started with a young woman, barely in her 20s, brought into the morgue after a devastating car crash. She had no immediate family listed, no one to claim her body. But what caught my father's attention wasn't the tragedy of her death. It was the bracelet on her wrist, a delicate, intricate piece of jewelry, encrusted with diamonds. It was worth more than he had ever seen up close. At home, my mother was dying, a rare heart condition, one that required an immediate surgery they couldn't afford. The hospital had already given up on them, saying they needed the money up front. And that night, standing over the dead girl's body, my father made a choice. He slipped the bracelet off her wrist. His hands trembled, not from guilt, but from desperation. He told himself it didn't matter. She was dead, and the bracelet would just be buried with her. What difference did it make? He met his best friend, a man who knew how to sell things without asking too many questions. They pawned the bracelet for $80,000. His best friend took a cut of $5,000 because he knew my father needed the money more. My father took his cut of $75,000 and paid for my mother's surgery the next day. She survived. The doctors called it a miracle, but that was the last good thing to come of it. It started small, a nagging feeling that someone was watching him. Shadows in the corners of rooms where no one stood. Then came the phone calls. At first, they were just silent. He would answer, expecting a voice, but there was only dead air. Then, the whispers began. Faint, almost like the wind, but unmistakable. "Why did you take it?" The whispers often echoed. He'd checked his call log, but there was never a record of these calls. His wife never heard the phone ring. Neither did his friend. He tried telling himself it was stress, guilt manifesting in strange ways. Then he saw her. Late one night, while preparing a body for burial, he looked up from his work and froze. Across the room, near the cold metal cabinets, she stood, the girl from the accident. Her mangled face still bore the scars of the crash, her eyes hollow and accusing. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. He shut his eyes. When he opened them, she was gone. But she kept returning, in reflections, in windows, in the dark corners of his home. She was never fully there, always just out of reach. He told himself he was hallucinating, but the fear in his bones told him otherwise. Then, the calls changed. The whispers turned into screams, blood-curdling, raw, furious. "Give it back," the whispers screamed. He ripped the phone from the wall, but the calls didn't stop. His cell phone, his work phone, even the morgue's landline. It was as if the wires themselves carried her voice. His best friend, the man who had helped him sell the bracelet, laughed when my father confided in him. "It's guilt," he said. "That's all it is. You need to forget about it." But a week later, his friend was found dead in his apartment. No signs of struggle, no obvious cause, just dead, eyes open, mouth slightly agape, like he had seen something in his final moments. That's when my father stopped sleeping. He tried everything: therapy, confessions at church, even medication. But the hallucinations only grew worse. His nightmares turned into waking terrors. The girl wasn't just appearing anymore, she was speaking. He would wake in the middle of the night to find her standing at the foot of his bed. "I just want it back." The whispers kept coming. Once, He awoke to the feeling of cold fingers pressing against his throat, as if someone was trying to choke him in his sleep. But when he gasped for air and turned on the lights, there was no one there. The paranoia consumed him. He avoided mirrors, avoided shadows. He stopped working late hours, stopped answering phones. My mother grew concerned, but he couldn't tell her the truth. She was alive because of what he had done. He couldn't take that away from her, but his mind was breaking. His handwriting in the diary became more erratic, his words barely coherent near the final pages. She's everywhere. I see her in the glass, in the water, in the spaces between the walls. I tried to return the money. I donated every cent. It didn't stop. I buried an empty box in her grave, hoping she'd take it. She didn't. Seemed like she wanted more than the bracelet. Like she wanted my mother's heart. My father was eventually committed to a psychiatric hospital, diagnosed with an unspecified psychotic disorder. But no medication, no therapy, no prayers could save him. He spent 15 years there, tormented by something no one else could see. And then, he died. As I closed the diary, my hands were shaking. My father had lived a nightmare, one that ended with him wasting away in a hospital bed, raving about a woman no one else believed existed. I wanted to believe it was just guilt, that his mind had created the horror as a punishment for what he had done. But deep down, I wasn't sure. That night, as I sat in his empty house, the phone rang. I didn't answer. Now, I ask you, do you think my father was just consumed by guilt, or do you believe she was real? What would you have done if you found yourself in her father's shoes? I want you to think deep about it before you respond in the comment section. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to help our stories reach more people who love this kind of stories. Before we continue, you might have noticed that I adjusted tone in narrating style. Please bear with me. I did it because most people were not focusing on the stories but rather on the voice. So I had to switch my narration tone so people would focus more on the stories and not be misled. Thank you for understanding. Now back to the stories. I've worked in a morgue for almost 6 years. The job itself isn't as grim as people think. You get used to it. The smell, the quiet, the way the building settles at night. It all becomes background noise. I never really felt uneasy working here, until I started noticing what my co-worker was doing. His name was Mark. He'd been working at the morgue longer than I had, and at first I just thought he was a little off. Not in a dangerous way, just in the way people who spend too much time alone sometimes get. He didn't talk much, kept to himself, and always volunteered for night shifts. That was fine by me. I preferred working alone anyway. But little things started bothering me. One night I came in for a shift, and Mark was finishing up his. I found him standing in the storage area, just staring at one of the drawers. His back was to me, and he didn't even flinch when I walked up. "Everything okay?" I asked. He turned his head slowly, like he hadn't expected me to be there. Then he nodded and walked past me without a word. Weird, but whatever. Maybe he was just lost in thought. I shook it off and got to work. Then, a few nights later, I noticed something else. The bodies were being repositioned. It wasn't dramatic, just subtle changes. A head turned slightly in the wrong direction. An arm that wasn't quite where it had been before. At first, I thought I was just remembering things wrong, but it kept happening. One night, I logged a body, a man in his 60s who had died of natural causes. Everything was routine. I did my checks, placed him in the drawer, and locked it. When I came back the next night, the drawer was unlocked. Not open, just unlocked. I knew for a fact I had secured it. And then there was his mouth. I had closed it before placing him in storage, but now his lips were slightly parted, just enough to show his teeth, like he had tried to whisper something before he died. I started paying closer attention after that. Mark always arrived early for his shifts, not just by a few minutes, sometimes by an hour or more. I'd find him in the back, standing over a body, his expression blank. Whenever I asked what he was doing, he'd just say, "Double checking." One night, I got stuck working late. Mark came in like usual, but this time he didn't see me. I was in the records room, and from where I stood I had a clear view into the storage area. He walked over to one of the drawers, unlocked it, and pulled it open halfway. He stood there for a moment, just looking down at the body. Then, slowly, he reached inside and adjusted its arms. He moved them carefully, almost gently, folding them over the chest like a funeral pose. Then he whispered something. I couldn't hear it. I didn't want to. I watched as he smoothed the hair back from the corpse's forehead, running his fingers over the skin in slow, deliberate strokes. Then he closed the drawer, locked it, and sighed like he had just finished a difficult task. That was the night I decided I needed to know what was going on. The next shift, I came in early. I told Mark I had forgotten something the night before and needed to check my paperwork. He barely acknowledged me, too busy preparing for his shift. I went straight to the security room and pulled up the footage from the past few nights. At first, there was nothing unusual, just normal routine work. Then around 2 a.m., Mark started opening the drawers. Not all of them, just certain ones. He would stare at the bodies for a few minutes, sometimes touching their hands or adjusting their heads slightly. And then, I saw something that made my skin crawl. On the footage from 3 nights ago, Mark was alone in the room. He had pulled out a body, a young woman who had been in a car accident. He stood over her for nearly 20 minutes, doing nothing, just watching. And then, he started talking. There was no audio on the footage, but his mouth was moving. His expression changed. Sometimes he looked angry, other times sad, and then he laughed. Not a full laugh, just a small chuckle. Then, as if it was the most normal thing in the world, he leaned down and put his ear close to her lips, like he was listening for something. I shut off the footage. I didn't need to see more. That night, I confronted him. Mark, what the hell are you doing with the bodies? He didn't react at first, just kept filling out paperwork. Then, without looking up, he said, "They don't like being alone." I felt my stomach drop. What? He finally looked at me. They talk, you know. Not with words, but they talk. I didn't know what to say to that. You ever notice how some drawers don't stay shut, he continued, or how their hands move just a little from where you left them? I wanted to tell him he was insane, but the truth was, I had noticed those things. They don't like being forgotten, he said, turning back to his work. So I keep them company. I quit 2 weeks later. I don't know what Mark is doing now. I don't want to, but sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I still hear his voice in my head. They don't like being alone. As a forensic technician at the city morgue for over a decade, I've handled thousands of cases. But one particular incident from 2019 still haunts me, not because it was supernatural, but because of its disturbing reality. It was a routine Wednesday afternoon when we received a body from a local nursing home, an 82-year-old male who had reportedly died of natural causes. During the initial examination, I noticed something odd about his left foot. The second toe was missing, and the wound appeared fresh, definitely post-mortem. I immediately notified my supervisor and the medical examiner. What followed was one of the most disturbing investigations of my career. The nursing home insisted the man had all his toes when he was pronounced dead. Our facility's security cameras revealed something unsettling. A new hire, someone who had only been working with us for 3 weeks, was recorded entering the cold storage at 2:47 a.m., spending exactly 12 minutes inside. When confronted, he broke down almost immediately. He had been collecting body parts to sell to medical students on the black market. Apparently, there's an underground market for human specimens, and certain body parts can fetch hundreds of dollars. He had been doing this at his previous job at another morgue in a different state, which explained why his employment history showed frequent moves. The investigation uncovered a small cooler in his car containing 3 fingers and 2 toes from different bodies. He had carefully selected older bodies, thinking no one would notice or care. He specifically targeted bodies that were scheduled for cremation, assuming the evidence would literally go up in smoke. What makes this story particularly disturbing is how long he might have gotten away with it if he hadn't become careless. The missing toe was noticed only because I happened to be particularly thorough that day, checking between the toes for signs of pre-existing conditions that might have contributed to death. The incident led to massive changes in our security protocols. We installed additional cameras, implemented a 2-person rule for cold storage access during night shifts, and began doing more thorough body checks during transfers. The most unsettling part was reviewing old cases and wondering how many other bodies had been desecrated without anyone noticing. The former employee was charged with multiple counts of abuse of a corpse and trafficking in human remains. He's currently serving time in state prison. But the case revealed a darker side of the industry that most people don't know exists: the black market for human body parts and the vulnerability of the deceased in our care. We had to notify several families that their loved ones' remains may have been tampered with. Some of them sued the facility, and rightfully so. Our reputation took a massive hit, and it took years to rebuild trust with the community. This case taught me that real horror doesn't involve supernatural elements or ghostly encounters. It's about the living, people who view the dead not as someone's loved one deserving dignity and respect, but as commodities to be exploited. Sometimes the most terrifying things in a morgue have nothing to do with the dead, but with the living who are entrusted with their care. I still check everybody extra carefully now, paying special attention to the extremities. Every time I enter the cold storage, I remember that case. It's not the dead we need to fear, it's the living who might take advantage of them. The most chilling part? When we interviewed his former co-workers at other facilities, they mentioned missing personal effects from bodies, things that could easily be explained away as lost during transport or processing. We'll never know exactly how many bodies he tampered with before he was caught. Some families will never know what really happened to their loved ones' remains. That's the true horror of working in a morgue, not the supernatural, but the very real potential for human depravity. It's changed how I view my role as a protector of the dead, ensuring they receive the dignity they deserve in their final rest. After 15 years as a medical examiner, I thought I'd seen everything. But an incident in January 2024 made me question not just my professional judgment, but the entire system we rely on for identifying the deceased. It began with what seemed like a clerical error. A body was brought in from a single vehicle accident on the highway, a man in his mid-30s who had apparently fallen asleep at the wheel. The police report was straightforward, and his identity was confirmed through his driver's license: Michael Roberts, age 34. The first irregularity appeared during the initial examination. The body showed signs of previous surgeries that weren't mentioned in any of Michael Roberts' medical records. This isn't uncommon. Sometimes records get lost, or procedures aren't properly documented. But something felt off about the whole situation. The deceased had a distinctive surgical scar on his lower back that appeared to be from a recent spinal fusion, yet Michael Roberts' medical history showed no such procedure. More concerning was a poorly healed fracture in his right forearm that should have been clearly visible in the driver's license photo taken just 6 months earlier. I decided to dig deeper. The fingerprints we took didn't match the ones on file for Michael Roberts in the DMV database. This happens occasionally due to technical issues, so we ran them through the national database. What came back chilled me to the bone. The prints matched those of Benjamin Torres, a man reported missing from a neighboring state 3 months earlier. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Benjamin Torres had been officially declared dead 2 weeks ago. His body had supposedly been identified, autopsied, and cremated in another facility. I immediately contacted the other morgue. They sent over their files, including photos of Benjamin Torres before cremation. The photos showed a different man entirely. Someone had created an elaborate chain of misidentifications, but why? As I investigated further, more inconsistencies emerged. The driver's license found on our John Doe was extremely convincing, but ultimately fake. The real Michael Roberts was very much alive and living in Florida. He had reported his identity stolen 6 months ago, but hadn't followed up on the case. Working with law enforcement, we uncovered a disturbing pattern. Over the past year, at least 6 bodies in different states had been misidentified in similar ways. Each case involved stolen identities, expertly forged documents, and bodies that didn't quite match their supposed identities. The breakthrough came when we examined the contents of the vehicle more thoroughly. Hidden in a secret compartment under the spare tire, we found a laptop. The forensic team discovered encrypted files containing details of a massive identity theft operation. Our John Doe had been part of a criminal organization that specialized in helping people disappear. They would steal identities, create false documents, and even stage deaths using unclaimed bodies, or people who had died without families. But something had gone wrong. Our John Doe had actually died, taking many of the organization's secrets with him. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the criminal enterprise itself. It was how easily they had exploited the gaps in our system. They knew exactly how morgues operated, understood our identification protocols, and knew which details would and wouldn't be checked thoroughly. The investigation revealed that someone within the medical examiner's system had been helping them. A former employee at multiple morgues had been selling information about procedures, access codes, and database operations. This insider knowledge allowed them to manipulate the system with frightening efficiency. The case forced a lot of morgues in the country to review their identification procedures. We discovered that our reliance on certain standard documents and protocols had created vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The assumption that official documents were genuine had become a dangerous weakness. But the real horror came 3 weeks into the investigation. While reviewing security footage from our facility, we noticed something odd. During the night shift, someone had accessed drawer 208, where this body was stored for exactly 7 minutes. The camera angle didn't show clearly what they did, but when we examined the body again, we found something that had been missed in the initial examination. A small microchip had been surgically implanted at the base of the skull. It contained encrypted data that, when decoded, revealed identities of dozens of people who had used this service to disappear. Some were criminals escaping justice, others were people running from abusive situations, and some were simply looking to erase their past. The case is still ongoing. Every week, we discover new connections, more bodies with mismatched identities, more families who thought they had cremated their loved ones, but had actually been given someone else's remains. The ripple effects are devastating and far-reaching. This experience changed how I approach every case now. I no longer trust any document at face value. Every identification requires multiple independent verifications. The most frightening part is knowing that for every case we discover, there are probably dozens more we've missed. What keeps me up at night isn't the criminal enterprise itself. It's the knowledge that our system, designed to provide closure and dignity in death, can be so easily manipulated. Every time I walk past drawer 208, now empty, I wonder how many other bodies in our facility aren't who we think they are. The person who accessed the drawer that night was never identified. The security camera in that section mysteriously malfunctioned shortly after, erasing all footage from that week. Someone had known exactly how to cover their tracks, suggesting the organization's reach might extend further than we initially thought. This case taught me that the real horrors in a morgue aren't supernatural. They're the ways humans can exploit death for their own purposes, turning our systems of identification and closure into tools for deception. Sometimes, the bodies in our drawers tell stories far more disturbing than any ghost story could be. As the senior pathologist assistant at our county morgue, I've dealt with countless unusual situations. But what happened in March 2022 changed how I approach every case, especially those involving routine procedures. It started with a seemingly standard case, a 45-year-old female, Jennifer Marshall, found deceased in her apartment. Initial police reports suggested natural causes, possibly a heart attack. She had been dead for approximately 24 hours before discovery. Nothing unusual about the case warranted special attention, but protocol required basic blood work for toxicology screening. I was training a new assistant, Mark, that day. He was fresh out of school, eager to learn, and this was his first week of hands-on training. We were performing a routine blood draw from the femoral artery, a standard procedure we do hundreds of times a year. The first warning sign came when the blood we drew appeared unusually dark and viscous. In my experience, post-mortem blood typically coagulates but maintains a relatively consistent texture. This was different, almost tar-like. I made a note but continued with the procedure. Within minutes of collecting the sample, Mark complained about a burning sensation on his hand where he had been holding the vial. He was wearing standard latex gloves, but when he removed them, there was a visible red mark on his palm. I immediately implemented biohazard protocols, had him thoroughly wash the area, and documented the incident. The situation escalated quickly. By the time we sent the blood sample to our lab, Mark's entire hand was red and starting to blister. We sent him to the emergency room while I continued processing the body, now with doubled protective gear. The preliminary lab results came back within hours, and they were unlike anything I'd seen in my 15-year career. The blood showed extremely high levels of multiple toxic compounds, some of which our lab couldn't even identify. More disturbing was the presence of a synthetic compound typically used in industrial cleaning products, at concentrations far higher than should be humanly possible. I called the police detective assigned to the case. A thorough search of Jennifer Marshall's apartment revealed she had been a cleaning service supervisor at a major chemical manufacturing plant. Further investigation uncovered that she had been stealing and ingesting small amounts of various chemicals over several months, building up astronomical levels of toxins in her system. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Mark's condition deteriorated rapidly. What started as a simple skin reaction developed into severe chemical burns, and within 48 hours he was in the ICU with organ failure. The doctors were baffled. They'd never seen anything like it. Even with just that brief exposure through latex gloves, the cocktail of chemicals in the deceased's blood had caused devastating damage. The investigation revealed something even more sinister. Jennifer Marshall had been systematically poisoning herself with industrial chemicals, but not out of suicidal intentions. She had been documenting everything in a detailed journal found hidden in her apartment. She was deliberately turning her body into a toxic weapon, knowing that after her death, anyone handling her remains would be exposed. The journal contained newspaper clippings about morgue workers and funeral home employees. She had meticulously researched post-mortem procedures and knew exactly how her body would be handled. She had calculated everything, from the types of protective gear typically used to the standard procedures for blood collection. It turned out she had developed severe paranoid delusions about the medical establishment after her mother's death in a hospital years earlier. This was her elaborate revenge plan to create a biological weapon out of her own body. We had to completely revise our protective protocols. The case led to new guidelines for handling bodies with unknown chemical exposure. Every suspicious death now requires advanced chemical testing before any invasive procedures. The entire industry changed because of this one case. Mark eventually recovered after 2 months in the hospital, but he never returned to pathology work. The exposure left him with permanent liver damage and chronic health issues. The last time I spoke to him, he had switched careers entirely, becoming a high school science teacher. The most chilling aspect of this case wasn't the immediate danger. It was the realization that someone had deliberately weaponized their own body, planning their revenge from beyond the grave. We now have to approach every case with the possibility that the deceased might pose an intentional threat to the living. This incident fundamentally changed how I view my work. Everybody that comes through our doors could potentially harbor hidden dangers. We no longer take routine procedures for granted. Simple tasks like blood draws now require extensive precautions and preliminary testing. The case also led to a nationwide alert in the mortuary industry. Similar incidents have since been discovered in other states, suggesting that Jennifer Marshall's case might have inspired copycat attempts. It's become a new kind of occupational hazard that nobody in our field had anticipated. Sometimes I think about how close we came to an even worse disaster. If we hadn't noticed the unusual properties of the blood, if we hadn't immediately implemented biohazard protocols when Mark showed symptoms, the exposure could have affected our entire staff. The truly horrifying part isn't the physical danger. It's the psychological impact of knowing that someone spent months meticulously planning to harm strangers who would handle their body after death. It forces you to question every case, every procedure, and every assumption about the bodies in our care. Now, whenever I train new staff, I tell them this story. Not to scare them, but to emphasize that in our line of work, there's no such thing as a routine procedure. The dead can still pose very real dangers to the living, not through any supernatural means, but through the deliberate actions they took while alive.